What if one woman inspired two of the greatest love songs of all time, written by two best friends who also happen to be rock legends? This is the tangled, passionate, and heartbreaking story of Pattie Boyd, George Harrison, and Eric Clapton. A story of love, betrayal, spiritual searching, and timeless music. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more music history that hits all the right notes. The story begins in 1964 on the set of A Hard Day's Night, when a young model named Pattie Boyd was cast in a small role. One of the Beatles, George Harrison, was instantly smitten, but Pattie, then dating photographer Eric Swain, wasn't available. At least not yet. After telling her friends about meeting George, she felt something shift. She broke things off with Swain and soon returned to George with a simple answer. Yes, they could go out for dinner. 2 years later, in 1966, George and Pattie got married. At first, it seemed like a dream match. Despite the chaos of Beatlemania, the two carved out a private life rooted in shared passions for Indian spirituality, meditation, and vegetarianism. They built a life that, at least for a time, felt meaningful and deeply connected, far from the screaming fans and endless touring. But even the most beautiful beginnings can hide the seeds of future heartbreak. George Harrison met Eric Clapton in 1964, the same year he fell for Pattie. Clapton was then playing with the Yardbirds, opening for the Beatles at a London gig. While all four Beatles were present, it was George and Eric who instantly connected over their shared passion for the guitar. But Clapton saw himself differently from the pop stars around him. He considered himself a serious blues musician, devoted to authenticity rather than mainstream fame. Meanwhile, George, though part of the most famous band in the world, craved the kind of respect Clapton commanded as a guitarist. Their admiration for one another would spark a close, complex friendship that blurred the lines between music, brotherhood, and eventually, love. As their friendship deepened, George invited Eric to play lead guitar on While My Guitar Gently Weeps, a rare move since the Beatles rarely featured outside musicians. It was a sign of trust, but also a glimpse into George's inner conflict. He was drifting from the Beatles world and edging toward Clapton's more guitar-centric universe. At the same time, George was coming into his own as a songwriter. One of his most iconic contributions, Something, was written for Pattie. Frank Sinatra once called it the greatest love song ever written, praising its quiet intensity. It never even says, "I love you," yet conveys everything. It was a musical confession, timeless and tender. As George became increasingly absorbed in Eastern philosophy and spiritual pursuits, he grew emotionally distant from Pattie. Into this growing void stepped Eric Clapton. He and Pattie saw each other more frequently. Dinners, songwriting sessions, long talks. It became clear that Clapton's interest in Pattie was more than friendly. In 1970, Eric invited Pattie to a private listening session. He played her a new song he had recorded with Derek and the Dominoes. The song was Layla, a searing, anguished cry from a man in love with a woman he couldn't have. Pattie was stunned. It was one of the most powerful pieces of music she had ever heard. But it put her in an impossible position. The public nature of the declaration, the intimacy of the music. She wasn't ready to walk away from her marriage. Not yet. That same evening, Pattie and Eric were at a party in North London. George wasn't there at first, but when he eventually showed up and saw them together, he confronted them. "What's going on?" he asked. Clapton didn't hesitate. "I'm in love with your wife." It was a shocking, emotional moment. George, stunned, asked Pattie, "Are you going with him, or are you coming home with me?" Pattie chose to go home with George, but the damage was done. George grew more distant than ever, and the love they had once shared began to unravel for good. Heartbroken and rejected, Clapton retreated into isolation at his home in Surrey. He fell deep into addiction and self-destruction. Derek and the Dominoes broke up. He stopped performing. He stopped releasing music. he barely even left the house. The only exception was a few isolated performances, including George's concert for Bangladesh in 1971, where Eric famously passed out on stage. Friends organized the Rainbow Concert in 1973 to help him recover, and eventually he began to emerge again, sober from harder substances, though his alcohol use worsened. George, meanwhile, released his acclaimed solo album All Things Must Pass and remained active musically. But his marriage to Pattie was fading. His infidelity, including an affair with Ringo Starr's wife Maureen, pushed Pattie further away. By the mid-70s, Eric and Pattie began speaking again. This time, when Eric told her he still loved her, the situation had changed. Pattie's marriage was in ruins, and she was deeply unhappy. She joined Eric on tour in the United States, but rather than finding freedom, she was swept into the chaos of his lifestyle. The drinking, the partying, the emotional intensity. Pattie, unprepared for life on the road, felt increasingly lost. What she had hoped would be a new beginning was quickly unraveling into another painful chapter. Then came a strange twist. Eric made a bet with a friend that he could get his name in the newspaper the next day. To win, his friend called the Daily Mail and claimed that Eric Clapton would be marrying Pattie Boyd the following day. The next morning, the story was printed. Everyone saw it, except Pattie. When she confronted Eric, he asked her to marry him for real. Caught off guard and uncertain, she said yes. They were married that Friday. There was no honeymoon. Eric brought Pattie along for a few more tour stops, then told her to go back home. His drinking worsened, and the emotional highs of the wedding quickly gave way to cold distance and dysfunction. Despite everything, Pattie tried to hold on. But one evening, Eric told her he had met someone else in Italy. The woman was pregnant with his child. For Pattie, who had long hoped for a family with Eric, the news was devastating. After years of emotional whiplash, betrayal, and heartache, she finally left him for good. Though their relationships were marked by pain and betrayal, George and Eric both created their most iconic love songs, with Pattie as their muse. Something Remains one of George Harrison's most beloved works. Intimate, elegant, and deeply personal. Pattie has said she is honored to have inspired such beauty. For Eric, Layla and Bell Bottom Blues captured a raw vulnerability rarely seen in rock music. Wonderful Tonight, written years later, would become another emotional tribute to her. These songs not only tell the story of their feelings, but have become universal expressions of love, longing, and heartbreak for listeners around the world. The emotional wreckage of this love triangle was real, but remarkably, George and Eric eventually rekindled their friendship. They remained close until George's passing in 2001. Even Pattie reflected later that despite everything, there remained a strange kind of familial bond between them. The music, the memories, the heartbreak, they were forever linked. When asked years later if he still loved Pattie, Clapton didn't hesitate. Very much.